Guten Abend miteinander, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen zu der Ringvorlesung heute Abend. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this lecture tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Chiara Barbieri. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Evolutionary Biology and Environmental Studies at the University of Zurich. And she will talk about genetic footprints of pre- and post-colonial contact in the Americas. Just a few words to introduce Chiara. She has a PhD in molecular anthropology from the University of Bologna, together with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, and equally a Master of Science in Biodiversity and Evolution from the University of Bologna. And of course, we all look to the University of Bologna with great respect, since it was founded in the year 1088 and is the oldest European university and one of the most prestigious, of course. So welcome here, also as a delegate from this prestigious institution. Chiara's research interests, that's from her website, are with molecular anthropology, human population history and prehistory, human migration, that's the topic, of course, diffusion and contact. She's worked in South Africa, in South America, and in particular on the congruence between gene and language transmission. So I was a little curious to see what actually you've been working on more recently, and I found that article in Nature Scientific Reports 2017, Enclaves of Genetic Diversity-Resisted Inca Impacts on Population History. Now that topic for me was very interesting on two behalves. First, because we have a PhD student who will have her disputatio this week on the genetic and cultural origin of the Karinga people. So one of these people that were dislocated by the Inca emperors in the late 15th century. So there is some coincidence here. And then of course, because we've been dealing with the issue of genetic and language transmission in a module at the prehistoric archaeology throughout the semester. So we're really interested to hear what you will tell us, maybe also about this topic. Yeah, I don't know exactly what your talk is about, but you will introduce, of course, your topic yourself. So please, Chiara.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Philippe. So good evening, and thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be part of this interdisciplinary seminar series. And today I want to contribute to this conversation with the perspective of a geneticist who is dealing with broad anthropological questions. And the topic of today is history of migration and contact in the American continent. But before going straight to the topic, I would like to give you a brief overview of my research asset. That's the background that I apply in my research. So I work with a multidisciplinary approach. This means that I sit together with specialists from linguistics in particular, history, archaeology, anthropology, and we try to decipher the biological diversity of humans and the cultural diversity of humans, thinking that they are shaped by similar demographic events. So by deciphering these footprints, we try to reconstruct our past. And we put together not only data, but also hypotheses from all of these disciplines, trying to learn from each other and trying to complement our knowledge. And the topic of today is human migration. And the idea, of course, is that people move and migrate, and they carry with them their genes, as well as their culture and their language. As these features can be transmitted vertically through generations, and are somehow stable in time and space. But we all know very well that cultural features are transmitted not only vertically, but spread also horizontally. They can diffuse. And sometimes we might reconstruct history where genetics and culture tell us some kind of different histories. This is not a problem. This is in fact very interesting because also these cases of mismatch tell us something about the history of populations. And what I work with is human genetics, and the idea is that by reading the DNA of a person, we can read the DNA of all of the ancestors of this person, from which they inherited all of these pieces of DNA. So reading the DNA is reading the history of our ancestors, that's the idea. And we can compare single individuals, and we can read how the DNA tells how related they are. So it's a measure of relatedness. It can tell us how far back in time was their last common ancestor. But we also compare the genetic diversity between populations, so between groups. And this tells us more about the patterns of all of these groups of ancestors. And in this thing, we can measure other interesting demographic patterns, like when two populations diverged, or when two populations came in contact, if population goes through a demographic expansion or a reduction in size. And I want to tell you from the very beginnings that DNA studies, of course, have some limitation. And if we think, again, at the level of the individuals, of the single individuals, yes, DNA can tell us very interesting stories about the possible origin of our ancestry, but can never tell the full story, can never tell much more about your identity. For example, today you can buy this DNA kit that tell you about your ancestry, and I think it's very fun, of course, but certainly they're not going to tell you who you are, because the answer is, of course, very complex. But still, there is an element of interest in trying to find some patterns of, again, relatedness within individuals and also between populations, as I said. But here the problem is, so what is this population? It's a concept that we use in different disciplines, from the scientific side, but also from the side of the humanities. And in our case, the population is the genetic pool. Our discipline is called population genetics, and is founded in a large work, theoretical work that comes from the last century, where statisticians and modelers were really understanding how DNA evolves and how it's passed. And this is framed on these ideal populations that are an abstract concept. Reality, of course, is different. So in theory, we have to identify human subgroups so that we can have our base of research and understand how these groups interact. But in reality, human genetic diversity is not shaped in discrete clusters. It's a continuum of diversity that, of course, varies from one extreme to the other of the continents. And it's also very important to know that in this line of diversity, anything that we can call a population is the result of some level of admixture at some point in time. So we don't have anything like a pure population. So what can we do? We just have to think about this point in mind, these points that all geneticists agree on, but still we're going to use this because it's the base of our analysis. And now you understand that a population is a concept that is very flexible, depending on our research question. For example, my DNA could be grouped in the population of Europeans when I'm studying the diversity between Europeans and Africans. Or my DNA could be labeled Italian or North Italian if I want to go even fine scale. What we do very often is to use something that we call ethno-linguistic labels, because we think that language sometimes is a marker for groups that share a common history and might tend to marry with each other. So sometimes we use these ethno-linguistic labels, and we're going to talk about use these as a proxy, as a convention, and we are seeing some examples also later in the presentation today. One very last note that I want to make is that genetic diversity in humans is very low because of the ecology of our species and the fact that we keep migrating all the time. So if we compare it to our closest relatives, the primates, you see how our overall diversity is much lower, but in particular, this one is the percentage that we use between population, and it's very small. But still, with this little proportion of diversity, we're able to decipher some patterns and see some small climbs of diversity, and we are focusing on these ones to tell a bit about the history of the groups. And okay, so after this little premise, I would like to talk more about the topic of today. Something that related to the history of the American continent. And I'm starting with this very iconic image that is showing you the encounter between Francisco Pizarro, the leader of the Spanish conquistadores, and Atahualpa, the Inca king, who met in Cajamarca in Peru in 1531. This is a very powerful image. It's an encounter of two very different and two very extreme civilizations that will change the future of a continent. After this, we're going to see the collapse of Native American complex societies. From this picture, we can think of three questions that I want to talk about today. One is how early humans first colonized the continent and how they developed such a diverging history from the one that we see in Europe. Then how they developed this complex cultural diversity up to developing these fascinating civilizations that the first Spanish conquistadores met. And finally, a few notes about what happens after this encounter of very diverging civilizations. So we start with the first entry in the American continent, the first migration in the continent. In this topic, genetics played a very important role to give us important evidence to understand this the very beginning of the migration. We know that the Americas are the last continent large continent to be colonized by Homo sapiens. And we know that the continent started to be colonized not early than 17,000 years ago, with the first migrant moving around the Beringian Strait, and with the amelioration of the climatic condition and a bit of the melting of the ice that was covering this region, they started to move south, probably facilitated by a coastal route, navigation route. What we also know is that jumping much south, humans were already in southern Chile 14,600 years ago. This is a very solid archaeological evidence for human presence in the Americas. We don't have many other robust archaeological sites in the rest of the continent here. What happened is that these early migrants must have moved at an incredibly fast pace, covering a whole range of latitudes, climate, ecoregions, in something that is a little bit more than 2,000 years. And this is very unique in the history of humans in the world. So what's special of the Americas? A recent diffusion and a recent collapse. In 400th century, after the arrival of the Europeans, you see this dramatic reduction of the initial population. And another thing that really puzzles our colleagues interested in the Americas is the fact that we see some of the highest linguistic and cultural diversity of the world. In this study, some linguists were sort of putting together the number of independent language families for the continents, and you see how in the Americas we have such a large number in comparison to the one that we have in Africa. And we know that anatomically modern humans in Africa have been there at least 200,000 years, and in the Americas only 15, maybe 17,000 years, but still they developed this high diversity of language. We are looking more into the proper genetic data, and we see what we can reconstruct with the genetic diversity of populations today. And many genetic studies would agree in reconstructing this kind of pattern of variation in population size through time. So from the past to the present, you see at some point that there is this rapid increase of population size around 15,000, 17,000 years ago, depend on how you calibrate the molecular clock. And with my colleague Silvia Ghirotto, we wanted to look a bit better into this signal to understand if we could narrow down exactly what happened there with an independent method. So we used the simulations, and we simulated different demographies that will give us different genetic profiles. So we wanted in particular to focus on the entry in the Americas and see if we can differentiate an instantaneous expansion, like a demographic explosion, or a more gradual expansion. And we wanted to see if we can read the moment of the contact with the Europeans with a so-called bottleneck, so a demographic decline, or without a demographic decline. So we ran all of this simulation, computational data, and each one gives us, okay, this is how your DNA would look like with such a demographic history. And then we compare with the real data for all the populations that we have. And we see where we can support one or the other story. What we see is that the real data for many populations agree on this model. For a few cases in populations of the Amazon, we cannot distinguish between these two models. It's a bit like saying that in some population of the Amazon, the population decline was not so dramatic, maybe. But what we see in a very robust... this is the population size. So there is an initial population size of a few hundreds of individuals, and then we try to say, okay, what happens if this population size instantaneously become maybe 10,000? And then we do a lot of this varying all of these parameters. And the important part is that this model is never supported by the real data. So this is another evidence, together with this one, that says that the expansion is like a demographic explosion. And this is interesting because when I look at the data that comes from archaeology, I see that a similar kind of reasoning about increasing in population density was done with archaeological data, with the density of radiocarbon calibrated data for the continent. And this study with archaeological data suggests a more gradual increase in the population size. And I'm thinking, no, the genetic doesn't agree with this story. And what I suggest, maybe, is that we are just not picking up the most ancient archaeological site that would make the history of the two parts in congruence. So like maybe at the very beginning there was really a demographic expansion with a lot of archaeological sites that we didn't excavate. And what I find very interesting, considering this particular history of the continent, is that maybe this effect of demographic expansion, which has a magnitude that we cannot match in any other part of the human history, maybe is related to this formation of such a high linguistic diversity. Imagine at the very beginning this population migrating in a unpopulated continent and diversifying very rapidly in groups that didn't share much with each other and developed a very early setup of cultural diversity. Now we are going into a slightly more recent time, and we are talking about the dynamics of colonization in South America in particular, where most of my research is based. When we talk about South American continent, we see again why genetic analysis is important. The colonization of the continent is very ancient, as I showed you. Some of the earliest settlements of human remains are dated around 11,000 years ago. We see formation of cultural diversity, complex societies, we would say very advanced, very sophisticated society, but there is no written history. So in the whole continent, no one of these societies was able to produce written records. So the only records that we have for the time is the one of the early Spanish conquistadores, which is, of course, a very biased piece of history because it's the history of the winners, which is very common. But so maybe the closest thing that we have in the continent is the quipu, which you're going to see in this picture. The quipu is a system of knots and ropes of different colors that was used in the Andes by the Inca Empire in particular as an accounting method for administrative purpose. It is possible that they were using it also for expressing more complex stories, but at the moment we are not able to read them. So maybe this also we have a limitation in that. And again, genetic is showing us some possible scenarios, like some attempts to explain the diversity with two major migration routes for colonizing the continent, one along the coast and one in direction into the Amazon. And genetic data is also proposing quite consistently a simple model of diversity for South American continent, where we have large societies that exchange with each other in the Andes, and small groups isolated from each other in the Amazon. At a first sight, it might seem counterintuitive, because we think of people living in the mountains, for example, here in Switzerland, and we think that people in the mountains are a bit isolated and sometimes live in small groups and tend to be a little bit endogamous. But this is not the case for South America, for the orography of the Andes. This mountain range consists of a series of altiplanos that are quite well connected in the long distance. So we know that there have been streets going all over the Andes since millennia ago. So the Andes are more connected than the Amazon, where the forest is very thick and communication goes mostly over rivers. But this is again a very oversimplified picture. For example, in recent time, archaeology is showing us presence of large complex societies also in the Amazon that we have a less understanding of because archaeological excavation in the forest is more difficult. So now I'm showing you some new data from a collection of population, as we are going to call them, from the past years. And so this is new data that we have been generating from living populations in rural areas mostly. And all of the data that I'm showing you is the result of a collaboration with South American colleagues that have been taking care of data collection, contact with the community, also returning the results. And so these are my main collaborators for this broad data collection that includes many countries of South America and Mesoamerica. And here I'm showing you what is the genetic structure of the continent. So we have this genomic data from a set of samples that is covering the diversity of the Andes, the Amazon, and also for the first time the coast, which was a bit underrepresented in the available literature. We have a population that speak languages from different language families, and we want to understand a bit how the diversity and the contact is shaped. From this plot, we see the presence of different ancestry components at different percentage in the individual. So each bar is one individual that can have multiple percentage of ancestry, let's say. What we notice is that population from the Andes, like this one, and the coast, like this one, they all share a lot of these orange-yellow components. So they share the same history, more or less the idea. In the Andes of the south, we see this blue component, which is anyway very, very close to the orange one. In the Amazon, we have these two blocks of ancestry, the dark green one and the light green one. Now, this dual ancestry in the Amazon was not previously described because nobody ever looked at the genetic diversity in this region. And here maybe you can appreciate it a bit better, how populations from the South Andes, the coast, and the north of the Andes are grouped together. This is just representing the relative distance between the populations, genetic distance. Here in the Amazon, we have this broad Amazon group, which is different from this branch, which I'm calling here Amazon North, which is the one that was not reported before. So we are adding something to the model that I showed you before that says only Andes and Amazon. Here we are saying that in the Amazon, we have one, maybe more component that we didn't see yet, that are very important to understand the earliest population differentiation in the continent. And I now want to tell you about the part that I like more, which is the history of genes and languages. And let's start by thinking why genes and languages should go together. One of the current framework for the history of language families is the one proposed by Colin Renfrew, Jared Diamond, and Peter Bellwood, where they suggest that the largest language families of the world would have diffused with actual people expansion. This is to say, the big language family don't diffuse only with culture alone. They just say, for example, okay, I'm hearing this group speaking this language, and I'm going to speak the language too. But they actually diffuse because people move and have kids and pass their genes. And why these expansions? One of the triggers, one of the causes of this expansion is associated to the passage to food production. So when the society becomes agricultural, they have this surplus of food production that actually results in demographic increment of the population. So here you see how we can connect the points into something that actually has some like a cause-consequence explanation. This theory was applied to big language families of the world, of course. The first one is the Indo-European language family of Europe, for which is very clear that there was a strong demographic influence of people migrating. Now, the experts are not really sure if the migration was the one from the Neolithic transition from the Levant, or if it was more influenced by the migration of the steppe herders a bit more recently. So the debate is still open, but surely either two cases, there was something mediated by people moving. In Oceania, we have another large language family, which is Austronesian, and here the story seems pretty linear. We have archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, and genetic evidence agreeing on the time and the modality of population moving from Taiwan and colonizing the Pacific. This is a tree of languages that shows us this history of movement, and this is the scenario reconstructed with DNA. Finally, in Africa, we have another very classic scenario, which is the one of the Bantu. The Bantu agriculturalists migrating 4,000 years ago brought the Bantu language family with them, of course, and resulted in a genetic homogeneity of this large part of sub-Saharan Africa. And for the Americas, we don't have a very strong candidate. This story was not fully explored for the continent. But the best candidate that I think we have is Quechua. Quechua is the largest language family spoken in South America. It's composed of some sub-branches that are independent from each other. And as I'm working with linguists that are specialized in Quechua, there is no agreement on when and how Quechua spread. Some people associated the Quechua with the Inca Empire. Of course, the geography of the extension of the two largely coincide. But surely Quechua is more ancient than the Inca Empire, which is a very recent phenomenon. We tried to study if Quechua spread with people also in this region. First, with this data set that has Y chromosome data. Y chromosome is a marker inherited on the paternal side. And here we are looking at people that share the same Y chromosome. That means that they probably had one shared grandfather. So here the lines connect two different populations where there is people that share a common ancestor. So they have been in contact, they've been exchanging people, moving people. And you see how there is a lot of sharing in this area, which corresponds to this purple Quechua 2C language. But here there is a kind of a gap, and here there is a little bit of sharing happening here, but not much else. So in this work, we thought, okay, surely here people were really moving their language around. But maybe Quechua arrived in the north more with cultural influence. And it's difficult because we don't know how to distinguish, for example, the action of the missionaries that were bringing Quechua as a language of evangelization, like a lingua franca. And this would be very recent in time. And then we thought, okay, but let's look at a full genomic data. So here we are generating data for the full genome, not only for the Y chromosome. And let's see if there is something that we were missing with the Y chromosome alone, because the Y chromosome is the history of men only. And so let's see if we can make a more complex picture. And while the sharing is more concentrated within the groups like before, also like here we have the coast, that they share with each other and they don't share really with anybody else. Also the case, again, of the Chachapoyas, which I'm not talking a lot, but was about that paper, where the Chachapoyas don't share with anybody. There's a particular case where genetic and history do not agree. But we also have a little bit of sharing between Quechua speakers in this region of Ecuador and Colombia, and also in the center of Peru, and in particular, Quechua speakers of the Andes and of the Amazon. So long-distance contact, and also contact between Andes and the Amazon that we saw in the previous pictures. We thought that they were separated. Of course, they are not separated, but it's good to see that the story is more complex. So maybe language as a preferential vector of exchange and migration. And here we have, in this part, we try to see if we can see some footprint of the complex societies of the region in the people who live today in this part of Peru in particular. Everybody knows the Machu Picchu, one of the 7 wonders of the world, built by the Inca. Maybe not all of you know that major complex societies started to develop in the coast much earlier, like 4,000 years ago at least. This is Chanchan, which was the largest urban center of South America, inhabited until actually the 17th, 18th century. So we have large complex societies in the coast and in the Andes of Peru. Did they leave a trace in the people who live today? We look at another genetic footprint, which is called runs of homozygosity. And there are these blocks of homozygosity. And if populations have larger blocks, it means that they have a small population size. If we look at this worldwide, you see that in the Americas, everybody has large blocks. Because of the early entry in the continent, you remember, only a small founding population colonized an entire continent. But let's see if the population then have other further smaller size, or if they kept a bit larger, so in relative with each other. This is an analysis of these blocks of row in different populations. Everybody has a peak here, and this is because of the initial entry 15,000 years ago. Everybody has it. But then these populations don't have any other of these large row, and this line go down quite steeply. So we find this profile in the coast, in the Andes, and in a couple of populations in the Amazon, which we didn't expect, because in the Amazon we don't have trace of this very big society. Then the other groups in the Amazon, they all have this bump of these very big blocks here, and this is because they had a further reduction in size. But this part in particular is very interesting. So we confirm in the Andes and in the coast, big population size, big demographic groups. But maybe there is also something in the Amazon that we are trying to explore. And finally, as I promised you, we tried to districate a bit what happened in the Native American history and the development of these cultures and society, and then what happens after the meeting with the Europeans. So, of course, the meeting with the Europeans looked like this. A disaster. There was a dramatic population decline. But here I want to see if the DNA can tell me when this meeting and this admixture happened in different groups. And here the history, again, can be simplified in like the ancestry components in the Americas. We can find 3 very different ones. The first one is the one that I've been talking about until now, Native American history. Now we're going to see how the European component is distributed and how the African component coming from the Atlantic slave trade is also distributed. These components are separated by thousands of years of history. So, for example, this is the same plot that you saw before. we color the three components, and we see for each individual the percentage of Native American, African, or European. This is, again, a simplification of the history, because we don't have the exact source of migration, the exact source from Africa or from Europe, but we have something close. That's how we do it. So these are three urban populations, very admixed. Our populations, where we went again to villages, a bit far from the city, have a very high component of Native American component, that here is the yellow one. We also find this very high Native American history in the Andes, in the Amazon, and in the coast. But there is, of course, a little bit of European history and African history in some of them. And now what I'm trying to do is to time this admixture. How do we do it? Because with the DNA, these blocks of admixture are larger if they are recent. It's like in one generation, you would have like big pieces of your genome that you can distinguish from your father, from your mother. But if you want to trace back a grandparent, the blocks come smaller and smaller after generations. So we know this little trick, and we can time the admixture between these components. Here you see in the Amazon, some populations, not all of them, show some of these admixture signal. And we find it at the beginning of the 1600 years. In the coast, this admixture is more recent, while in the Andes, this is a bit intermediate, but on the recent side. Now, this method is biased because it's showing me the most recent big admixture event. That means that probably for everyone, admixture started rather early with encounters with the Europeans, at least. But we pick up the last big admixture event. So what is interesting is not that populations of the coast of the Andes kept admixing until here. Well, until the beginning of the 19th century, mostly. Then it stops. But in the Amazon, in this population, it stops much more earlier. That means that maybe this group, after a first meeting with the colonizers, they sort of escaped further encounters. Maybe they they migrated to some regions of the Amazon that were more protected, so to avoid the obvious problems with these encounters. Also, in recent time, this admixture seems to not happen until today, and this probably is the result of the sistema de casta that the Spanish ruler were imposing over the society, avoiding mixed marriage at some point. So it was not actually possible to marry with the native nation or with the African working in the plantation. So at some point, this story separated again. So we have a few points today that I find are important to make our picture of history of migration and contact in the Americas a bit more complex and possibly a bit closer to reality. In the Amazon, we find a different block of ancestry, let's say, that was not found before. And maybe there are other ones waiting to be described, because we don't have really a complete genetic map of the continent at the moment. We add the coast to this picture that I showed you before, which was not really represented. And we see that the coast has this similar effect of large populations in contact only with each other. They don't really share with the Andes very much. They just share within the coast. So sharing type means the extent of the movement and of the contact, which, again, population can move and trade, but if they don't leave kids, then we don't see it with the DNA. And we add some links between the Andes and the Amazon that were, of course, suggested before by other disciplines, but we start to see a bit some special cases where this has a genetic effect that we can read a bit better. And in particular, for the Quechua language, we suggest that might have been actually movement of people carrying their language. So, and more in general, I hope you can appreciate how with the incredibly interesting history of the Americas, we are able to really enrich our history and our understanding of these dynamics, putting together disciplines that can work well with each other. And with this, I'd like to, of course, list people that participated in this research. In particular, colleagues that spent a lot of time in the field, working with the communities and explaining the projects and collecting these DNA samples. Also, I showed you a bit of these examples of bioinformatic analysis that we can do with the DNA with some statistic and computational effort. And other colleagues that are supporting the project since long time, in particular here in Zurich, Kentaro Shimizu, and a few of linguists and historians that I've been working with in the past years. And I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.